Hi, everyone. This is Malvina Miller Complainville from Fortuna Admissions, and I'm here with my colleague, Michael Malone, who's going to tell us a little bit about the interview process at Columbia Business School. Michael, before we jump in, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure, Malvina. First, thanks for having me, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My background, I've been in higher ed for over 25 years, and I've spent the bulk of that working in a business school environment. For the past 7 years, I've served as an associate dean for Columbia Business School, and I've worked with their full-time, their executive MBA, their MS programs, and their PhD programs, overseeing everything from admissions and financial aid to student affairs and working very closely with careers. But prior to this work as an associate dean at Columbia, I've spent several years in the career management side, both at Columbia, where I was a director for career education and advising, and then I spent time at Kellogg, where I was the head of their career management center. So I'm hopeful that my background and perspective will be of some value during this conversation today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. And you and I have a career, we have that in common, the career background.
Indeed. I feel like it helps from an admission standpoint, Malvina.
Absolutely.
I feel like it really helps to give a rounded set of recommendations to clients, being able to see how the story ends and then working backwards to how they want to begin their journey.
I absolutely agree with that. So Michael, tell us a little bit about the application process, the actual application process for Columbia Business School. What does that look like?
Sure. So the application process at Columbia is not fundamentally very different from most other schools. There are several components to it, including transcripts, standardized test scores, essays, the application itself, and recommendations. And I wanted to point out a couple of key elements that may be a bit unique to Columbia, or at least maybe things that you want to know going into the process. Regarding test scores, there have been a number of schools who have said that we are waiving or we can take it after the fact. Columbia has chosen to maintain their requirement for test scores. Clients rather, can submit their test scores within 3 weeks of their application being completed. So once they have all of the other elements, they need to submit their test scores, and it needs to be within 3 weeks.
That's really good to know.
Yeah. What they're looking for, though, is that they're looking for the unofficial test scores. And then once a student has been admitted, then they have to submit official test scores. So if you don't have officials yet, it's understood that you're going to be submitting from you as an incoming student. But at the point that you are accepted, then you'll need to submit official scores.
Okay.
With regard to the essays, they have what I would call 4 essays plus an optional. When I hedge a little bit and I put it in somewhat air quotes, the first essay is actually a tweet level. It's a 50-character submission that asks for your goal, for your immediate post-MBA career goal. That's followed by a 500-word essay focusing on your 3 to 5 year and your longer-term post-MBA goals. Mm-hmm. They ask you for why CBS is a good fit. That's a 250-word essay. And then which is also a 250-word essay. Lastly, there is an optional essay, which is your opportunity to explain anything that may be out of the ordinary about you, or anything specifically that you want to call the admissions committee's attention to that you think might both help your candidacy and really reveal your character. That really is what the essays are meant to do. Last component I'll talk about is the recommendations. If you are someone who is a professional, you have had 6 months plus of time in the field, they are looking for you to have at least one recommendation from a current supervisor, and they're encouraging that your second recommendation comes from a previous supervisor, if that's at all possible. There are some exceptions if you're doing their 2+2 deferred program, or if you are applying for readmission or reconsideration. There are some special rules around that, but by and large, it's a 2 recommendation process. Mm-hmm. And ideally, you're taking at least one of them from a current supervisor and another potentially from a previous supervisor.
Okay, great. So, and then, so you've submitted your application.
Mhm.
What's the next step after that? What does the timeline look like? And
Sure.
what are you waiting for in terms of
Sure.
reactions from the school?
So Columbia has taken a pretty strong stance in recognizing the anxiety that goes along with the application process. And I really appreciate this about their approach. They have committed to saying that once applications are complete, so once you have submitted all of your elements, missing pieces need to be submitted no later than 3 weeks after the rest of your application. So
Mhm.
that could be test scores or anything like that. And I mentioned that previously. Once your application is complete, it's going to be reviewed by 2 members of the admissions committee, and they're going to tell you very quickly whether or not you are being invited for an interview or they are going to deny your application. And that enables you to then focus on other opportunities in other schools. So they do have a pretty quick turnaround time. The goal, once they get the completed application and they have all of the pieces in,
Mhm.
is that within 2 weeks, you will receive either an invitation for an interview or notification that they're not going to continue with your candidacy. If you're invited for an interview, most of the interviews at this point are being conducted by alumni. And that's a function in some ways of COVID, but in some ways this has been part of Columbia's strategy for quite some time. As you know, Columbia is one of the schools that has the highest number of applications coming through. So their admissions committee is pretty stretched in terms of the number of applications that they review in a given cycle. As such, they really have to work closely with and rely heavily on their alumni interviewers. And so they put a good effort into making sure that they are trained and that they are part of the admissions process by conducting the bulk of interviews. What I found in talking with clients, Malvina, is that they oftentimes really appreciate that they get the opportunity more often than not to work with alumni, because there is a certain level of background and research that they can do. They can find commonalities given that they've gone through the program that a client is potentially seeking to go through. And so that they found really helpful, just being able to get a little bit of background and to find potential affinity points to talk about during their interview process. Once the interview process is conducted, then the folks that have completed the interview, they will hear within another 2 weeks. So it takes, I'd say, beginning to end, about 6 weeks from the time that an application is put forth and all of the materials are put together, to the yes/no interview decision, to conducting the interview, to hearing whether or not you've been accepted or not. And one last piece of it that I would say is that there's not an advantage or disadvantage to whether or not you interview with an alum versus an admissions committee member. My limited experience in seeing the difference between the two would suggest that admissions committee member interviews tend to be a little bit more efficient. But that said, they also have done several thousand of these. And so they know pretty quickly what they're looking for. And I'd say my one suggestion then to clients is that they want to make sure that they are crisp and have good answers thought out ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, and that they've actually practiced out loud as well.
That's right.
Sometimes you have the stories really clear in your mind, and when it comes time to verbalizing the stories, it doesn't come out as crisp as you would like.
That's right.
So that's one of the tightest turnaround times among the M7 schools.
It is. And again, I think that there was a great deal of effort put into the empathy for folks going through this, recognizing that this is a stressful process. And Columbia puts a pretty big effort to understand the choices that potential students need to make in order for them to get into a top MBA program. And so they recognize that that they want to shorten that timeline, because it ultimately does provide more choices to candidates to be able to determine if they need to pivot, if they need to rethink things, and so forth.
Now, with the pandemic that is currently happening globally, how has that impacted the interview piece of the application?
Well, I think the process itself, Malvina, has been impacted because, as in most economic downturns, applications at top business schools are up significantly. And as a result, it means, by definition, that with more folks in the pool, that a lower percentage of folks are going to be getting interviews. So it's going to be more competitive by nature. I do think that because there are even more folks in the pipeline, it means that even more of these interviews are likely conducted by alumni interviewers than even in a normal cycle. And so it does provide that potential advantage then to do some research on the alum to get a sense of their background and to be able to identify those affinity points.
And Michael, is the fact that the interviews are now mostly online, does that impact how the interview is then looked at as part of the overall application?
That's a great question. You know, I think for the most part, all top schools are going to look at the interview as part of a whole. They really are looking to get to know the candidate in every possible way they can, through third-party recommenders, through application and the details in that, through essays and sort of self-presentation, and through the interviews. That said, in a normal admission cycle where folks might have an opportunity or more of an opportunity to spend time in person on campus and have some of the informal interactions that they might have, in the absence of that during COVID, I do think that the interview likely takes on a greater import. There are fewer person-to-person touch points. And as a result, I do think that it's especially important this cycle that folks do everything that they can to practice, to identify what their key messages are, and to come across with a sense of passion and purpose and clear answers as to why this particular school at this particular time is a good fit for them.
Great, good advice. Any other last bit of information or advice that you would like to share with our listeners?
Sure. So one other piece that I think is an important element, and since you and I both have a careers background, Malvina, I think that this is an important piece for everybody to consider, whether or not it comes up in a formal interview or not. I think that it's important to actually consider what you would do if you don't get into the school. It is possible that that can come up in the conversation, but I think that having a clear sense of purpose and career goals, whether or not that particular school invites you for admission or not, I think conveys to the school a sense of concreteness and dedication to a goal for its own sake. That they're not only looking at the school as a means to an end, that you're looking at what you are really dedicated to. And so I would think about that, and I would give some structure to that, whether or not you're asked it. There have been instances where I think that folks have been asked that question. And so I think that it's good to consider at least prepping some points to be able to speak to that. But that sense of greater purpose will also convey your energy and enthusiasm for long-term goals. And when you're talking about making a critical admissions decision and deciding which great candidate gets a spot over another great candidate, I do think that that sense of purpose and dedication can often be a decision maker for them.
Often when you have a clear, identified impact, the impact that you want to have is clearly defined and clearly identified, it allows you to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of the career paths that will lead there. And you can have a plan A and a plan B, and you can show that you can bounce back depending on what the situation is, which
that's a great point. I think there are many business schools who would say that they identify resilience as a key leadership trait that they are seeking. And I think, research has borne out that that is one of the more specific leadership traits that helps folks to be successful in their careers. So I agree with you. Anything that conveys that you've given enough thought to say, if my plan A doesn't work out, I have a plan B and even a plan C, and I'm going to stay the course, even if it's not a linear course, I think is a strong communication that they're prepared to actually pursue this and that it's not just a dream.
Absolutely. And even more so in times of uncertainty, it becomes even more important.
So true.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was really very informative. And thank you so much for sharing this advice with us.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Malvina. And I wish everyone the best of luck as they pursue their next steps in the application process.
Bye, Michael. Thank you.